Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In a cowboy movie, more so than in most other films, the armorer plays an important role, a disproportionately important role. Cowboy films are characterized by gunslingers and gunslinging. In cowboy films, it's depicted as normal to settle scores, to settle disagreements with a gun. And justice tends to be a matter of who draws fastest and shoots straightest. In the movie Rust, guns were needed on 10 of the 12 film days, with multiple guns used per day. The production halted on the 12th day of its 21-day shooting schedule, following Hutchins's death. Live rounds were called for on at least half of the shooting days, and this is according to call sheets sourced by the LA Times. Interestingly, the slang use of the term, and I'm not sure if this applies in America as well, I know it does in Britain, the slang use of the term cowboy, calling someone a cowboy today means they're reckless and ignorant of potential risks. Think of a driver, pilot, or movie crew who might be described metaphorically as a bunch of cowboys. In this episode, we're going to deal with something that probably doesn't sound very exciting. It's the race to find an armorer before production started on Rust. Once again, our source material is the excellent long-form article published in the LA Times almost a month ago. I think it was published on the 20th of November. Once again, I'll put a link to that in the description. As we're about to see, what ought to have been a simple, ordinary position being filled became increasingly fraught as one potential armorer after another either wasn't available or simply wouldn't accept the offer. We've got to see the hiring of 24-year-old Sarah Zachary, the prop master and head of her department, and 24-year-old Hannah Guiterrez-Reed, the armorer and prop assistant. We need to see their hirings and their role in the context of this race to have a crew up and running in time for production. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen. Thank you to the 100 or so people who've subscribed since the last video. Remember to like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the first thing I want to deal with is the issue of more than a dozen candidates that were approached before Sarah and Hannah. That's a lot. Sarah and Hannah weren't even close to being the first or second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth choices. In their investigation, the LA Times spoke apparently with more than a dozen candidates that were approached to crew on Rust, and this was in local New Mexico, but also as far afield as Los Angeles and Texas. This recruiting campaign went on throughout late August and into September. Remember, Helena Hutchins was shot on October 21st. And now we go to the period in the timeline, 1 month and counting. According to the LA Times, quote, on September 21st, exactly 1 month before Hutchins was shot, Gabrielle Pickle, the Atlanta-based line producer who arrived in New Mexico several weeks earlier to run the day-to-day production of Rust, she reached out to Scott Sarge Rasmussen, an armorer in Albuquerque. And this was what she sent to him. She said, we are in a bind and need someone to start in props immediately. And this is something that the Times were able to source. The LA Times sourced this email between the line producer Gabrielle Pickle and Scott Sarge Rasmussen. Sarge Rasmussen was a good candidate on paper. He had the experience and he was available. And Sarge came pretty close to being hired. He even let them know he was offering to serve as the armorer. But the producers wanted to hit two birds with one stone. And this is quoting from the article. Quote, Rasmussen, who has nearly half a century of experience handling guns, ultimately wasn't interested in being both prop master and armorer. In an interview, he said he offered to serve only as the armorer, but never heard back. End quote. And that's, he never heard back from Rust, right? One has to assume the combined role meant a reduced salary and greater responsibilities. An experienced armorer could see that this job for the low-budget cowboy flick was below his pay grade. And that brings us to the third point, and we're now at September 23rd in the timeline, approaching the start of production. It's not clear whether Sarge is a member of the IATSE union, that is, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, or whether the producers preferred crew who weren't, but the next step was advertising the position on the IATSE portal. The advert read, quote, "Rust is in search of a prop master ASAP. Previous Western or Armory experience is a plus, but not necessary." And the same advert noted that the position would start that same day. It says it all, doesn't it? Armory experience not necessary. It's becoming very clear just how urgent staffing these final crew positions was becoming. And interestingly, Alec Baldwin used the word urgent in his ABC interview, where it felt kind of out of place and didn't seem to make complete sense.
And what's really urgent is the gun wasn't meant to be fired in that angle.
So what do you think? Was that a Freudian slip? That brings us to the fourth point. What was driving this urgency in the movie industry? The pandemic has slowed down many industries, airlines, restaurants, but also movies and movie production. Think about Top Gun Maverick. Filming was completed 2 days early on June 17th, 2019. It's almost 2.5 years ago. And they were hoping to release the film on July 12th, 2019, less than a month later. For reasons unknown, it was held over to the summer of the following year, with a release date set for June 26, 2020. In other words, slap bang in the middle of the pandemic. Then Paramount moved it 2 days forward to June 24th. Then the film was pushed back to December 23rd, 2020. It's been repeatedly postponed ever since, with November 19th this year being a more recent release date. 2.5 years later, Top Gun still hasn't been released. The next release date is early next summer in America, May 27th, 2022. Other big Hollywood fare have seen similar delays, including Black Widow, starring Scarlett Johansson, which saw its release date delayed 3 times over 6 months. Black Widow went on to set a quote-unquote pandemic record, but also faced a lawsuit from its lead actor. Spider-Man No Way Home, which released just a few days ago, was originally scheduled for a summer release this year and was delayed twice before its release in December. And think about it, these are all Hollywood tentpoles, big budget films. So the industry itself is in a kind of disarray, a kind of chaos. But within difficulty lies opportunity, and streamers were hoping to get a foot in the door by shooting smaller, low-budget flicks, while Hollywood lost its mojo. Rust was one such film, and it was never intended for the big screen. According to the LA Times, quote, "Fueled by generous tax credits and streamers hungry to produce new content, after production delays due to COVID-19, producers have flocked to New Mexico. The boom has strained the New Mexico hiring pool, leaving an insufficient number of experienced union film workers to staff all the productions clamoring to hire," end quote. And that is really the vibe that has been going on. Productions clamoring to hire, right? And trying to find experienced film workers, and they're not enough. And so, as I say, within this difficult period, you had certain players coming forward, and one of them was a Santa Monica-based lender called Bonded Media Capital. And they've been particularly active, according to the LA Times, during the pandemic, stepping in to fill in gaps as independent filmmakers struggled to find backing, struggled to find financing for films during this public health crisis, during the pandemic. So there's been an explosion in demand, and tax credits have provided financial incentives to get the film supply rolling again. And it's within this milieu that the whole Rust scenario materialized. Does that make sense? And that brings us to the fifth point, desperate to fill the position. According to the LA Times, quote, during the week of the IATSE job posting, the film's unit production managers were simultaneously trying to recruit Rasmussen and LA-based prop master Neil W. Zoromsky to run the props department. So they were obviously sending out kind of invitations, requests all over the place, desperate to land the right crew as soon as possible. But despite these efforts, both Zoromsky and Rasmussen, they eventually turned down the job. Quoting from the LA Times, Zoromsky, who had worked 3 decades in Hollywood, previously told the LA Times that he declined to participate, this is in the Rust project, after getting a bad feeling about the project. Like Rasmussen, he was put off by the producer's insistence that one person perform 2 important and time-consuming jobs. End quote. Now, it may be a case of playing Monday morning quarterback, but it takes a veteran of the industry to see the woods for the trees in this scenario, in this case. Neil Zoromsky didn't like the idea of 2 jobs being combined into one, especially these 2 jobs, and his bad feeling turned out to be spot on.
I got a bad feeling about this.
So what happened? Did the producers figure, well, let's go for a young, inexperienced, and naive person, that wouldn't know what lay in store for them? And isn't that why 2 young, inexperienced 20-somethings ended up filling the position? Does that make sense? Is that what happened? And that brings us to number 6, where we really answer that question.
She knew that the clock was the enemy, and we have to move forward.
The clock was very much the enemy, but the approach was precisely that. Even if things aren't quite right, the train has to leave the station on time. Even if the tracks haven't been properly laid in the past, the movie train needs to move forward.
She knew that the clock was the enemy, and we have to move forward.
With that attitude, it's easy to see how a movie can go off track, and that those accidental discharges, the first, second, third, fourth, that they weren't accidental, they were inevitable under the circumstances. Much of the prop master's work, including sourcing a multitude of period-specific objects and weapons needed for a Western, takes place during prep. Several experienced prop masters said they would expect at least 2 weeks prep time for a film like Rust, which was set in the 1880s. Prop masters want to make sure props look authentic and are in usable condition. That's another quote from the LA Times. Because this film was set in the distant past, the 1880s, what is that, 141 years ago, in order to be authentic, they've got to source materials that are not easily found. And that takes time. When they've got to go through history books, photos, people with experience. According to the LA Times, time was running out. Cameras were set to roll October 6th. Remember Baldwin's reference to weeks? Here it is again. And here we have several experienced prop masters saying 2 weeks minimum would be needed to prep. How long did Sarah and Hannah have? 8 days, wasn't it?
The clock was the enemy, and we have to move forward.
No wonder there was healing. No wonder there was a fear of reporting mishaps. Mishaps meant delays. In effect, exactly what happened to Elena led to the entire project being delayed, then mothballed. What everyone feared came to pass. Time is money, yes, but there's also another saying, more haste, less speed. And that brings us to the 7th point. The arms proprietor solves the problem. With time quickly running out, the PDQ arm and prop proprietor made the introduction of Sarah Zachary to the Rust producers. He doesn't identify them by name, but it sounds like it was a direct encounter. Remember, he also claimed he never set foot in the production office, but he did make an overture to them somewhere, somehow. And clearly there needed to be a link in the chain between the Rust production and the arms proprietor in order for the train to choo-choo out of the station. Seth Kenny was the dude that facilitated this process. and his company stood to benefit from the business. The question is, did a live round reach the set from PDQ Arm and Prop? Seth says no, but what we do know is a box of rounds arrived on the set that day. This is also quoting from the LA Times article. Quote, "In the days following the shooting, Sarah Zachary reflected on the events immediately preceding the tragedy in a text conversation with a fellow New Mexico film professional who spoke on condition of anonymity. That conversation was viewed by the LA Times. As Sarah Zachary struggled to understand how a live bullet had ended up in Baldwin's gun, she described how a new box of .45 caliber long Colt dummy rounds had arrived on the set that day." End quote. According to the USA Today, dated November 30th, 2021, quote, "An affidavit included with the warrant says Seth Kenney, the owner of PDQ, told investigators on October 29 that the live round shot from Baldwin's prop gun may have been reloaded ammunition bearing the logo of Starline Brass, the company that manufactures the dummy rounds and blanks his business supplies to movie sets." Seth Kenney described how Starline only sells components of ammunition and not live ammunition. Therefore, it had to have been a reloaded round, the document says. Prop master Sarah Zachary told investigators on October 21 that Rust got its ammunition from multiple sources, including Seth Kenney and Seth armorer Hannah Guiterrez-Reed, who brought rounds from a production she worked on previously. Sarah said she checked a box of ammunition after the shooting and found that some cartridges rattled, which signified them being dummy rounds, and this is the important part, while other cartridges did not. The affidavit also notes that Guterres' father, Hollywood armorer Thal Reed, told investigators in November that he worked with Seth Kenney on a different production around August and September. End quote. Thal Reed, Hannah's dad, has worked on famous flicks including Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Cowboys and Aliens, 3:10 to Yuma, and Tombstone. Going back to the article, during this production, Reed, that is Thal Reed, Hannah's father, said that Seth Kenney asked him to bring live ammunition to train actors on a firearms range. Reed said that Hannah's dad said that he brought a green ammo can that contained about 200 to 300 rounds that weren't made in a factory. That's hundreds of rounds, right? According to Hannah's father, Seth took this ammunition can back with him to New Mexico after the training, and one assumes that means to PDQ, right? That's the question. Though Hannah's father said he made several attempts to get the can back from Seth, he said that Seth told him to write it off, according to the document. Thal Reed, that's Hannah's father, stated that this ammunition may match the ammunition found on the set of Rust, the affidavit adds. And so there is a possibility that something that came from Thal Reed ended up in the gun on Rust. That remains to be seen, however. And that brings us to the eighth and final point, 8 days versus weeks. Sarah and Hannah met for the first time just 8 days before production began. Remember, Baldwin claimed in a tweet that they decided on the gun he was going to use weeks in advance. This suggests he either did so without Sarah or Hannah's say-so, or he's using the word weeks a tad loosely, and perhaps with a little license. In conclusion, I want to say that we can see the lead up to the production was fraught with time pressures, and one could argue that hiring Sarah and Hannah, that itself was cost cutting or cutting corners, or putting budgets and schedules ahead of safety or even common sense. In the next episode, we'll deal with issues the armorers dealt with following the start of production. This episode has dealt with issues leading up to production. And based on the LA Times investigation and description, we know when filming did commence at Bonanza Creek Ranch, the pace grew frenetic. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.